Hi, everyone. Welcome. We've been speaking about the first civil war and spoke about the rule of the first dynasty in the so-called Islamic Empire, the Umayyads. And now we're going to speak about the second civil war, the second fitna. And these are all sets of major events that occurred and that essentially marked the memory of Muslims and still inform Muslims today. So it's not about knowing all the events and all the dates. It's more about knowing why these places are important. And as we'll see, it's in the aftermath of the Second Civil War that the ultimate winner, a guy named Abdul Malik from the Umayyad dynasty, ends up having to restore legitimacy by re-emphasizing certain aspects of the Believer movement and transforming it into something much closer than what we recognize as Islam today. Now, in our previous class, we talked about the figure of Muawiyah. Muawiyah ultimately was the kinsman of Uthman, the third ruler, or Amir al-Mu'mineen, the commander of the faithful believers that ruled after the Prophet Muhammad died. He ended up partially defeating or waiting out Ali. Ali was the son-in-law of the Prophet Muhammad and was also his cousin. He was the fourth ruler after Uthman. He's the fourth ruler after the Prophet Muhammad and the one that came after Uthman. To make a long story short, Muawiyah and Ali were fighting for who was going to be leader of the community and leader of the new empire. Ultimately, even though Ali probably had the upper hand, he opted for arbitration. One of his followers then assassinated him. In the process, Muawiyah ended up taking power. Now, Muawiyah has a relatively long and stabilizing rule. It introduces many centralizing effects and transforms the capital away from Medina to Damascus. But on his death in 680, he designates an heir, basically his son Yazid, but many felt that he wasn't actually qualified to rule. And in fact, up to this point, there hadn't been a succession of father to son. And so many in the Muslim community still questioned, well, why should we accept this? Why should we accept Yazid as the heir? Does he really have the legitimacy to do so? And two other major candidates emerged. One was Hussein, the son of Ali, so this basically the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad. His supporters remained in Kufa, which was always a stronghold of people in support of Ali. So Kufa is in Iraq. Yazid had his base of support in Syria, which was the stronghold of the Umayyads. And then in Medina, another figure named Ibn al-Zubayr, or Abdullah, son of Zubayr, al-Zubayr, who was a companion of the Prophet Muhammad, actually knew him as a very young child, had a very strong claim over in Medina. Now, of these three people, they had claims because there was still a variety of different criteria for leadership. It was not accepted that just because someone was the son of the current ruler that they should necessarily rule. And as we talked about before, these are the four ideas of that the four ideas that defined the nature of leadership. One is piety, right? To what degree are you a faithful believer? Are you following the laws set out by the Quran, by the Prophet's example, etc.? So believing in monotheism, praying and fasting, and also believing in the coming of the end of times. How many leaders were actually following the prophetic example provided by Muhammad? The other, again, question is one of precedence. And by here, I don't just mean seniority, but also closeness in the community to the moment in which the Prophet Muhammad received his revelation. Obviously, those that joined him first their descendants had a greater claim to authority than those who joined him later when it was clear that he was going to win and he had a much stronger military force. Third is, again, kinship, questions of who is actually the closest in terms of blood to the Prophet Muhammad. And here, Ali and his progeny had the upper hand because ultimately Ali was married to the Prophet's only surviving daughter, that is Fatima. And also Ali was his cousin. And fourth is just pure effectiveness. Who was the most effective leader able to lead military troops and people in the most efficient manner. So these four criteria came to be. And unfortunately, Yazid was lacking in many of them. Although he was, to some degree, of the clan of Uthman, he was not a close, he did not have precedence. The Muawiyah, his father, let's go back to here, Yazid, the son of Muawiyah, lacked precedence. Muawiyah's father, Abu Sufyan, was one of the Meccans who refused the Prophet's message. He also was not seen as particularly competent, and he was also perhaps not regarded as the most pious person. And in this place, others like Hussein, who had both piety and had precedence and had lineage, kinship ties with the Prophet Muhammad, were seen as a much better and possible leader. And the same went for Ibn al-Zubayr, as we'll talk about. Now, already after the death of the Prophet, after the death of Muawiyah, Hussein starts gathering troops. He's been told by sympathetic supporters that he should start a bid for leadership. But Yazid finds out about this and sends a general out to stop him. And outside of a place called Karbala, in the day of Ashura, in the year 680, his troops are waylaid and they're completely massacred by the army. Hussein is killed, and this becomes a major moment in Islamic history. And again, here the grandson of the Prophet Muhammad has been killed by another Muslim army, by an army of believers. And for many who saw that Ali had the best claim for leadership, and with that, Hussein, this becomes a moment that needs to be marked and memorialized. And today we have a celebration called Ashura. Ashura, this means the 10th, because that was the day that it happened on. There are all sorts of different events that occur. One is marches, commemorations of the death of Hussein, including self-flagellation, as you can see here. There's other more benign and anodyne ways of commemorating it. So, for example, if you go to Turkey, one of the common ways, things you can eat is a dessert called ashure, which comes from, again, the name of the holiday. It's basically a sort of very tasty pudding made from boiled wheat kernels, topped with nuts, chickpeas, and pomegranate seeds and dried fruit. This is another way to commemorate Ashura when it just became a sort of general holiday. There's also a major pilgrimage for, as we'll see, a group of people called Shi'i Muslims. This ultimately is essentially the largest pilgrimage in the world, possibly even larger than the Hajj itself. About 18 to 20 million people participate in it every year. And it takes place over 40 days, leading up to the commemoration of an Ashura, of the killing of Hussein. And they come to Karbala, where there's now a gigantic shrine, seen here, commemorating the space of his death. And in fact, pieces of Hussein's body have been taken elsewhere. You can find one shrine in Cairo. So even though this is a relatively Sunni city, during the period that was ruled by Shi'is, they brought the head of Hussein to there. And then there's also another tomb in Damascus. And there's even passion plays that recreate the entire events of Karbala. And these become basic commemorations of this event. And this is done all over Iran, but you can also find it wherever there are Shi'is in the world, including many in South Asia. So here you have elephants, and in the Caribbean, where many South Asians were migrated to as workers, as coolies. And in this case, the procession ends up in the sea, and people go marching into the sea to commemorate the death of Hussein. We can quickly look at what one of these passion plays looks like. It's called Ta'ziyah.
Music, song, ritual, customs, traditions, history, taste, and aesthetics are performed in a narrative language by Shabi Khan, the actor of a Ta'ziyah. This historical mythical play reflects both the identity of ancient Iran and the religious beliefs.
You could ignore the ancient Iran stuff.
Historical and ancient roots of Ta'ziyah, like Sug Siyavash, which has remained, that was the Safavi and Zand dynasty. Besides purpose.
Let's see. Yeah, they practice it. Here's another version.
The characters of Ta'ziyah are divided into two groups. Those in the first group play the positive roles and are called Mu'afiqan, or approving actors. They appear in white and green cloths, which signify blessing, productivity, sacredness.
Okay, we're going to skip some of the commentary here. But what I want to point out here is that the death of Hussein marks a commemoration and the idea that the leadership of the community of Muslims should have gone to someone in the lineage of Ali, and through him, through the connection with the Prophet Muhammad, marks the start of a movement called the Shi'at Ali, the supporters of the party of Ali, which today is known as the Shia, or the Shia, the noun in general, collective noun. One person who is a Shia is called a Shi'i or a Shiite. And this is the start, not so much of an entire different theology as it is today, but at least of a separate community that believes that ultimately Ali has a special connection to the Prophet Muhammad and has the capacity to rule. And so therefore people descended from him make better and more legitimate rulers for the Muslim community. After the death of Hussein, there were still a number of supporters of Ali and Hussein, and they ended up rallying around a leader called Mukhtar in Kufa. Through these supporters, they end up taking Kufa by force, and they kick out all the Arabs who were not pro-Ali, and they punish anti-Ali people, often by physical force, executing some. Eventually, they were besieged in Kufa and then forced out and killed. But this kind of marks the end of Hussein as a candidate. Later on, he continued. He had sons, and these sons would maintain a role over the generations as alternate sites of legitimacy and rule in the Middle East. Now, that's happening in Kufa. What's happening in Mecca and Medina? Here we have a guy named Abdullah ibn al-Zubayr. So remember, Ibn means son of, al-Zubayr is the name of his father, Abdullah is his name. He was based in Mecca, and he had a power base in Medina as well. He knew the Prophet personally. He was 8 years old when the Prophet died. And he was known also because he was also the first child of the community in Medina. So he very much had an idea of precedence. And he participated in many different battles, especially against the Byzantines. He didn't particularly like the Shi'i or the Shia, specifically those of Mukhtar. He turned away from them, and perhaps for this reason wasn't able to launch a very strong response to Yazid. But he was a very eloquent orator, and talked constantly about Yazid's immorality, about how he broke the norms of piety and belief. But apparently he was also a very cold and snobbish person. And for this reason, he isn't able to launch a strong defense against Yazid. He has power bases in Medina and Mecca. In Medina, his troops are defeated. Some are possibly even enslaved, right? So at this point, they're still in the point where believers or different Arabs are being enslaved by Muslim armies. And then the armies of Yazid keep going, march on Mecca, and start besieging it. But during the course of the siege, it all falls apart for Yazid. His troops are not interested in destroying Mecca completely. Medina has been destroyed in the course of the attacks. They ultimately abandon Yazid. And at the same time, this is exacerbated by when reports that Yazid has died suddenly back in Damascus reach the troops. So Ibn al-Zubayr is suddenly saved from almost certain defeat. Yazid passes on his claim to his son, Muawiyah II, but his son, Muawiyah II, dies after a few months. And at this point, there's really no clear heir on the Umayyad side. Ibn al-Zubayr is over in Mecca, but barely has an army. Hussein has been defeated. And in this giant power vacuum, a man called Marwan, who is an very elderly leader of the Umayyad clan, so the clan that started the Umayyad dynasty, he is ultimately persuaded to make a claim of leadership, to say, okay, I should be the next leader of the Muslim community, and to keep the Umayyad dynasty kind of running. This ends up becoming the so-called Marwanid branch of the Umayyads. He does a few things. He's very old, so he doesn't actually live for a very long time. He actually dies after a few months in power, but he manages to repel a very strong attack that was being directed towards Damascus. And is ultimately his son, Abdul Malik, that takes over. So in all these names, the person to remember is this guy, Abdul Malik. Now, Abdul Malik is going to also fend off the Byzantines, who, sensing a moment of opportunity, send armies over to Damascus to take it back. He fends off the Byzantines. He takes out another pretender. He reconsolidates his power in Egypt. Then he takes out Kufa. And then he sends his general Hajjaj to Mecca. This time, Ibn al-Zubayr is defeated. The second siege of Mecca works. It's the end of the civil war. Basically, the Muslim community is now united under a different branch of the Umayyad family, that of Abdul Malik. Now, this is a massive and traumatic civil war. And in it, the only grandson of the Prophet Muhammad has been killed. Ibn al-Zubayr, who also was very close to the Prophet Muhammad, was killed. Mecca and Medina have been destroyed. Infighting has basically destroyed much of the army of the Muslims. And there is a need to essentially recreate legitimacy through new visions of piety, new visions of what the army would be, and ultimately restructure the empire itself. And that's what we're going to talk about in the next section, especially as we look at things like the coins and the new image that Abdul Malik would propose for the Muslim community.